Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Middle of the Road podcast. My name is John Thomas Hill, and in this particular episode, we're going to be talking about why political conventions that come around every 4 years are pretty much nothing more than 4-day-long political infomercials that have long since outlived their usefulness. Now, let me go give you some history about why we have political conventions, because before we had a primary system, before we had the way the media is today, where you can pretty much know everything there is about a political candidate and know the ins and outs, every little detail about their life. The political conventions were the way we used to elect a president, because what would happen is on the local level you would elect delegates to a convention, and they would go to the national convention and select a president. Now, there were still primaries back in the day, but generally they were not as solidified around a particular candidate, because back then you would have a native son candidate, a local governor or senator that was very popular governor or senator of a particular party, and they would run for president in that particular state so that they could throw their support toward a popular candidate, whether it be the one that was considered to be the front runner or somebody that was more in favor across the state but didn't have the resources to necessarily compete in that state. It's a long... Back in that time, before television really took hold, in the 60s and 70s and such, you had a lot of deal making going on behind closed doors. It was really the politicos that made the decisions. People voted, of course, but generally you had to be a hardcore Democrat or Republican to really have a say-so in the primary process. You didn't really focus on it until the general election, because back then the news media wasn't as prevalent as it is now. You got 15 minutes of news at 6 o'clock. Maybe you got a late night report. And this was in the 50s, of course, and to some extent into the 60s. The main focal point was newspapers. And back then, there was lag time between a story breaking and it getting onto the newspaper. So you had some chances to talk to the editors, to talk to the columnists and whatnot, and to basically butter them up and make them, or convince them to go to your side of things. And in many cases, the newspapers really made or didn't make candidates, made or break candidates, I should say. But then television came along, and it went from being ads in newspapers and buttons and stuff like that and yard signs to where you had radio was where it first really began with ads and such, and television came along. The first really big year for it was 1952, but in time it became even more prevalent over the course of, as television matured and became the media that it is today. The 1960 campaign probably was the first real television-driven presidential candidacy, because that up until the first debate, Nixon led in the polls, and then the first debate happens. John F. Kennedy looks great. Nixon doesn't look so great. It sways a lot of opinions around, and we've come to the point now where it is regarded that John F. Kennedy pretty much won the presidency primarily based upon how he performed in those debates, not just from a policy standpoint, but from a visual standpoint. He looked the part. He sounded the part while looking at it. So in that aspect of things, and I'm sorry if you're hearing some noise in the background, because I just turned on my computer and it's downloading some emails. So we come to today. where did we go from where you had smoke-filled rooms where the presidential nominees were selected to today, where basically it's a bunch of speeches and the whole vote process is already taken care of? It's basically a mere formality. I'm not exactly sure when the year happened when it was determined that by the political establishment that having contested conventions doesn't work. You could make a case for 1976 when it was the last time a Republican convention was somewhat contested. Gerald Ford was the incumbent president, but he was being challenged by the hard conservative Ronald Reagan. Of course, he won 4 years later. Ford held off the challenge of Ronald Reagan's conservative wing of the Republican Party, and Gerald Ford's moderate wing won out that particular day, but the seeds were sown after Ford lost that election to where the Republicans decided, you know what, we don't need to look bad anymore. We need to look like we have our stuff together. We don't need to look divided. At every convention since then, without fail, the candidate has been long since decided in the primaries, and the convention is pretty much a foregone conclusion. The Democrats had their own convention in 1980 where you had the possibility that the incumbent president could be ousted, not out of office, but ousted from being the nominee by a challenger. That was Jimmy Carter was the incumbent, who was very unpopular, but still running neck and neck with Ronald Reagan. Teddy Kennedy was the challenger. And there were some who liked him, some who didn't. Some who felt like Teddy Kennedy had a lot of baggage, including the whole Chappaquiddick thing, which I think in some ways pretty much doomed any realistic chance he ever had of winning the presidency. And I've often thought that part of the reason for that was self-inflicted, at least in a subconscious manner, because I felt like that there was a part of Teddy Kennedy that didn't want to be president, because if he became president, he would meet the fate of his brothers. That's just me. I don't normally delve into conspiracy theories or anything like that or trying to read people's minds, but I've often wondered if Teddy Kennedy was his own worst enemy when it came to higher ambitions than just being a senator from Massachusetts. So that was the last time you could probably say we had a contested Democratic convention. 84, the nominee was pretty much sealed up as Walter Mondale, although there was some drama that maybe Jesse Jackson might have enough support to pull off an upset. He still had enough to make a fight of it for a while, but some backroom negotiations kind of petered that out, and basically Walter Mondale was going to be the nominee. And then 88 comes along. Michael Dukakis is solidly behind the candidate, solidly the nominee. Jesse Jackson briefly looked like he might make a challenge, but it never panned out. But after 88, for all intents and purposes, the Democratic National Convention became a political infomercial. The 1992 Democratic Convention was meant to build Bill Clinton up in the minds of the voters as being the Southern Kennedy. It was meant to get away from the Slick Willie persona that the Republicans were foisting upon the country. Now, I look back at that convention. I watched it a bit back then because back then I was a political junkie, and watched C-SPAN quite a lot, and I watched both the Republican convention and the Democratic convention. I'll tell you the truth about it. The Republican convention was a traditional convention. It really didn't present the candidate as, they didn't have the infomercial way it is now. It was basically the old school way you did conventions. The 92 convention was the start of the Democrats becoming more about presenting the candidate and presenting the platform to the people in an infomercial style way, and getting away from the floor debates and all of that. And ever since then, in the almost 30 years since that election in 1992, political conventions have become pretty much snooze fest. There are no more floor fights or anything that's really... You might have a little something about a particular platform. Like this year, you might have had on the Democratic side the Medicare for all. Republican side, I don't think really there's any real platform fights, because they didn't adopt a platform. They just said, well, our platform is going to be whatever Donald Trump wants it to be. And I'm going to get into that a little later on, because I don't particularly like that for any potential party. Here is my theory about why conventions are the way they are. It's basically to groom the candidate, to put them before the national stage as and basically it's basically a science fiction convention for political nerds. And instead of being a bunch of different things going on, it's all about this one particular thing. Like Celebration is Star Wars convention. I don't know what Star Trek equivalent it would be. In my mind, this has got to be this is something I look back at, and I look at the conventions, and it amazes me that we are where we're at with these conventions. And it truly is, because conventions used to not be these snooze fest they become. The main reason for that is you don't want to have the perception of division in your party. Look what happened in '76 with Ford and Reagan. Look what happened in 1980 with Carter and not Mondale, but Carter and Kennedy. The perception that there was division within a party, especially in the Democratic Party in 1968, that was a nightmare. If you ever Google the 1968 Democratic National Convention, you'll know how much of a disaster it really was. And that began the impetus to kind of change conventions from being the old school smoke-filled rooms to where the primary system weeds out the candidates until the voters have selected one candidate. And that is our current primary system, which starts out in the two states that are very rural, to say the least: New Hampshire, one of the smallest states in the Union, one of the least populous states in the Union, and Iowa, another very small state. The tradition that they claim to have really is not that old, all things considered. I don't like it. I think that the primary system should be changed to where you have more of a balance between urban and rural states, where you have basically the entire primary process compacted down to where candidates have more of a chance to win in a short period of time. Personally, I think the presidential campaign is way too long to begin with. So we get to these conventions, and I've not watched a second of the Democratic convention. I've not watched a second of the Republican convention. I have no intention of seeing anything about it, because I already know what the platforms are. So why do we still cover them? Why do they still have them? It's basically to pump tourist dollars into this. It's basically to give candidates like state senators, county commissioners, city council people, an opportunity to get known by their party so that one day they may aspire to higher office. There is a reason for these conventions. There's a reason you have a state convention. That's why you have local conventions. The reason for these are to basically build up politicians for the future. It's to be seen and be seen, to see and be seen in the political circles, to garner support for potential runs for bigger office down the road. There's a lot of wheeling and dealing going on. So there is a reason for these conventions, but it's not the original reason. A lot of stuff doesn't go on in front of the cameras anymore, on the actual convention floor. The platform fights are hammered out way in advance, and usually, not all the time, usually the debates are handled pretty quickly. But to me, the conventions used to be fun to watch back in the 80s with my grandfather because there were issues. They did interviews. It was a really instrumental part of presenting not just the presidential candidate, but the party itself and the leaders of that party. Because back then you didn't see them all the time, unless you really watched Sunday morning news programs. And most people didn't. At least where if you're in a city that doesn't have a big church-going population, usually those political shows aired at the same time people were in church, at least from where I'm from. So you didn't have the you didn't have the 24/7. So this was an opportunity. You didn't have the 24/7 media. This was the opportunity every 4 years for a politician on a state and local level to make themselves known. If you were a senator or a representative, and you had a chance to get some face time before a major network, you're gonna take that and run with it and try and make yourself a bigger star than you were before then. Now, with 24/7 news networks and the internet and all this, you already know the players. They're well established. So all these speeches that are being done this week at the Republican convention and the Democratic convention last week are pretty much just for show. You know who these people are. And if you don't, you'll know them eventually, because those speeches were not necessarily aimed at you, but aimed at people in the establishment to like last night with Nikki Haley and Tim Scott. It's my belief that those two could be looking at 2024, expecting Trump to lose. They won't come out and say it. But to them, it's an opportunity to be seen if and probably when Donald Trump loses. And don't think for 1 second that there aren't some politicians in the Republican Party who are going, if Donald Trump's vote sinks, I might have a chance to, pick up the paddle, build my own boat, run in 2024, and beat Biden or whoever replaces Biden, whether it's Harris or somebody else. And this year, in the Democratic convention, I guarantee you there are some Democratic politicians who are putting themselves out there. If Biden loses, and there is a possibility he could lose. Remember 4 years ago when everybody thought, including myself, that Hillary Clinton was going to win easily? And I'll tell you why I think it's going to be different this year in a little bit. It's all about putting yourself out there, not so much the public in general, but to the political establishment and the media. Because if the media likes you, if you make those connections, you can get on the popular shows. You can get those talking heads gigs and basically make a name for yourself. You can get the radio show spots on conservative radio if you're a Republican, or to some degree on liberal shows out there, the few that are out there, mainly the ones over the internet. So, with all this being said, why should we make a fuss about political conventions now? The truth of the matter is, political conventions are outdated because the candidates are already decided. The delegate counts have already been made. And until there comes a day when we get to a convention where there's not been a winner selected, and I don't see that happening anytime soon, because they don't want the perception of weakness. You don't want people to perceive your party as being weak. And having a contested convention in the minds of the political world is considered very much a weakness. Go back 4 years. If Rubio and Cruz and Kasich had managed to win enough delegates to challenge Trump at the convention, it could have done a lot of damage to his campaign, to the point where it might not have resulted in his victory. And it could very well have been that they might have found a way to beat Trump at the convention, even though Trump led in the delegates, or may have led in the delegates. You don't win the race unless you have enough delegates to win the nomination. You could have the most delegates but not have enough to win the nomination, and there could be a floor fight, and next thing you know, because there have been incidents in the past where candidates have gone into a convention, this is in the old days, and they led in the delegate count but didn't have enough to clinch the nomination, and they lost out because of backroom politicking, because one candidate decided to let their delegates vote for, encourage their delegates to vote for another candidate. That doesn't really happen anymore, because by the time we get to the convention, the deals have been made, the party has made its decision, the voters of the party have made their decision, and we knew going into this year Biden was going to be the Democratic nominee, Donald Trump was going to be the Republican nominee. These conventions are nothing more than just infomercials. And the networks have not bought into it anymore, because used to be you would get wall-to-wall coverage. Now you get it like, I think the last 20 years or so, it's been just an hour at 10 o'clock. You would get a brief encapsulation of it. And that makes a lot of sense, because people don't want to sit around watching a convention when, especially if you're a network executive, they don't want to watch a convention where you've got all these other options out there. Back in the days of 3 television networks, and they're all playing the convention, what are people going to watch? Seriously, what are people going to watch? Nowadays, it's a lot more competitive. I have not watched a single second of them. I've followed them on the internet and such, and read the news stories and all that. But I've not watched any of it because I know what they're going to say. It's basically grandstanding at its finest. And it used to be interesting, now it's not. Because, quite honestly, all it is an infomercial. Now, I'm going to talk for a moment about what I think is wrong with American presidential politics and the political system in general. The two-party system sucks. Technically, we have other parties. You have the Libertarians, you have, I think this Constitution Party is still around. You've got the Greens on the left. You've got other little teeny-weeny parties that really don't amount to much at all. You're either a Democrat or Republican. In other countries, which have the Westminster electoral system, Westminster parliamentary system, you can have more than two parties be a factor. That doesn't mean that you're going to have 4 or 5 parties with a legitimate chance of forming a government, but you have the possibility of a two-party system, a two major party system, and then minor parties that will be needed to form coalitions. And in those countries, the tendency is when the electorate is not entirely embracing either major political party, that they tend to form coalitions which naturally become more moderate. For example, in the 2010 British election, the Conservatives formed a government with the Liberal Democrats, who are basically a more moderate party, who are at the time a more moderate party. Now I think they're more left of Labour again. Labour and the Liberal Democrats are basically moderate left to left parties, depending on the way the political wind blows. And the Conservatives are more of a moderate right party, depending on how the wind blows. Sometimes they're further right, sometimes they're not. Right now they're kind of really way out there to the right, for the British perspective, you know. So, how do we encourage more parties? Well, we've got to change the Constitution through the amendment process. That's why the founders put it in there, to allow us to make changes from time to time when the system isn't working the way it should for the betterment of the people. I think the Electoral College should be scrapped. Or, if we're going to keep it, have it to where it's not all or nothing. I think personally that if an election is not decided on election night, instead of sending it to Congress, the top 2 candidates face off in a runoff first Tuesday in December. Whoever wins that wins the election. Many other congressional races and senatorial races and gubernatorial races have the same thing in many other parts of the country. I think it's a simple matter of, if you don't get a simple majority and there's more than 2 candidates in a race, you should have a runoff between the top 2 candidates. Because it should be a clear majority who selects it. And here's the thing. In every election since 1992, there has only been one candidate to get over 50% of the vote and win. Do you know who that candidate is? Barack Obama. Bill Clinton did not get 50% in his 2 victories. George W. Bush did not get 50% in his victory. In his 2 victories. And he lost the popular vote in 2000, as we all know. And in 2016, Donald Trump won the Electoral College, which is what really matters, but lost the popular vote by nearly 3 million votes. The reason I think the Electoral College should go away is and this is the reason it's in there, is to give the more rural states a more balanced, an opportunity to have a say in the election. But in reality, it doesn't. Only the battleground states have a say. So now I live in one of those battleground states. But if you live in Alabama, if you live in Mississippi, Your vote for a Democratic candidate doesn't matter if it's the president. It might matter if they are a senator or a Congress representative or a state senator or a state House of Representatives or governor. But for president, it doesn't really matter. Because for all intents and purposes, that state's considered a red state. If you get rid of the Electoral College, then all the votes come into play. And don't give me this stuff, well, it'll just mean New York and California are going to matter. Look at Texas. Look at Florida. One's more of a red state than the other, although they're not as die-hard red as they used to be, especially Florida and even now Texas. But it's not like North Carolina is a small little state, or South Carolina for that matter. There are far more people that live in these so-called flyover states than in the states of New York and California. So, and here's the thing. In California, not everybody automatically votes for Republicans, or Democrats, I should say. You would think that any chance to kind of break up, and here's the thing, if a Democrat already right now has a 55 electoral college advantage right off the bat.
I'm not sure.
Sorry, that's Alexa. They got a 55 electoral vote because pretty much California is going to go to the Democrats. Same with New York, which is, I think, 38, something like that, which basically cancels out Texas for the most part. Florida is the only major state, the really big states, that is contestable. Although this year, surprisingly enough, Texas looks like it might be competitive. Whether it turns out to be that way remains to be seen, but the polls right now have Joe Biden, depending on which poll you see, within the margin of error. Now, am I expecting Joe Biden to win Texas? No. But I think, and this is a factor that people need to understand, is if Joe Biden were to lead Donald Trump in the polls going closer and closer to the election in Texas, that forces Donald Trump to campaign in Texas to shore up his support to where he could lose Georgia or North Carolina and Joe Biden campaigns there. So in reality, if you're a Republican and you see the polls in Texas, you're not very happy. Now, how do I think the election is going to play out? Here it is very simply. The Democrats have to win every state they won in 2016, plus Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. At least 3 of the 4. Those are the Rust Belt states that the Democrats lost in 2016, that they normally would have won at least 3 of them. 3 states right now, the last polls I saw, Biden had big leads in. Ohio is a toss-up. Depending on what poll you look at, Trump is leading in some Ohio polls, Biden in others. All Biden has to do is change 3 of those states into blue states, and he's the president. And I think he's got a good chance of getting all 4, plus North Carolina, plus Georgia, and maybe even Florida, and possibly Texas, which would be a massive coup for him. It would be a gut punch to Donald Trump if Biden were to win Texas. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but it's one of those things that if I'm a betting person, I don't bet my money on Donald Trump winning again. Yeah, I know his supporters are going to say, well, look what happened in 2016. Different matter. Here's why Biden is more likely to win this time around. Popularity. People liked Joe Biden. They didn't like Hillary Clinton. So simple. You look at the independents and moderates who almost every election decide the race. Independents like Joe Biden. They didn't like Hillary Clinton. And now you got the pandemic. And you look at the response the Trump administration has made to the pandemic. It's been a disaster. You compare us to other nations, it's a disaster. And no matter what, even if we get a vaccine that works before Election Day, it doesn't take away the fact of how badly it's been handled. Okay? This is not going to disappear on Election Day like some people like to claim. No, it's not. Okay? I would love for that to be the case, regardless of who wins. But the truth is, it's going to stick around a lot longer. And we got to live with that. Some people don't want to accept that. Some people don't accept the fact that the earth is round and the sun rises in the east. That's their business. If Biden wins 3 of those 4 states, he's the president. I think he's going to win all 4. I think he'll take Florida. I think he will give Trump a run for his money. And in Texas, I think it's a 50-50 toss-up, which is shocking, considering that pretty much every election since 1976, Texas has been red. A solid Republican state since 1980. Because the last time a Democrat won Texas was 1976. Jimmy Carter won it. This could be a difference. Now, I'm not saying it's going to happen. Elections inevitably get tighter as we get closer to the election. But a lot of things can happen. First of all, coronavirus cases could skyrocket. Deaths could skyrocket. That would be devastating to the Trump campaign. There could be more bad economic news. Trump really needs some good economic news. Really good economic news. Because even with modest good news, it's not going to matter because so many people have already lost their jobs because of this virus, including myself. Even though I do have a new job now, it's a temporary job, and I'd like a permanent job. And I had one until the virus came along. So there are a lot of people in my boat. Either they've lost their job and haven't found a new job yet, or they've lost it and taken a job that doesn't pay as much, or they're taking a temporary job, and they're trying to make it through until things get better. The simple fact is, right now, the economy is in the tank because of this virus, because of the response to this virus. But even before the virus began to take shape, there were signs the economy was going downhill anyway. The leading indicators were not good going into this election year. Before even the virus even was known late last year, the signs were not looking good. And you knew Trump's administration knew about this. They had to find a way to make things better. Because if an economy is bad in the presidential election year, just ask Jimmy Carter, just ask George, just ask George W. Bush, and John McCain. 2008, John McCain and Barack Obama were neck and neck. Then the economic crisis hits in the fall of that year. The stock market crashes. You have major financial firms in serious trouble or going under. And all of a sudden, you have the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression hit America. And that's why Barack Obama won in a landslide. Look at the economic numbers right now. They're worse than they were in 2008. We have a little over 2 months to go before the election. The stock market is still fairly strong. But the truth is, the American people know that there are millions still out of work, that we still have double-digit unemployment, that some of the people who've gone back to work are working in jobs that aren't paying as much as they had beforehand. The numbers are not great for Donald Trump. And I don't care how much bluster he comes out, I don't know how much fear and all this that comes out this week. The economic numbers are not great. You have a popular Democratic nominee. Yes, he's older than Methuselah, 77 years old, the oldest person ever to run for president. You have a 70-plus-year-old incumbent who will be 80 by the time he leaves office if he's reelected. There's no guarantee either man is going to serve out the 4 years. So, when you look at the long-term implications of this election, it's very clear that from the past, and this is something that if I'm a Biden advisor, the economy is stupid. It's the economy, just like it was in 92. The economy and the coronavirus are the two biggest issues you can hammer Trump with. Those are the biggest issues. Right there. And I don't care how much Trump blusters for law and order, because he sure as heck can't say anything about that, because some of his own people are behind bars right now. He's hiding his taxes. He's hiding other things. He's been evasive from investigations into his own administration. And the big one is Russia. So, as we proceed down the last, 10 weeks of this election, maybe not quite that much, my biggest concern is how ugly it's going to get. Will we see some violence? Will we see violence toward the candidates themselves? What about the virus? Will we see good news? Will we see more bad news? Most likely it'll be a bit of both. You're going to see some spikes. You're going to see some hope for a vaccine. You're going to see news spun all over the place. And the economic numbers, same deal. You're going to see some good numbers and bad numbers. It depends on which is more prevalent, the good numbers or the bad numbers. And people aren't stupid. In the end, elections are not won on very complex issues. In 2008, people were tired of Republican economic policy creating the crash of 2008. In 2004, the people decided they didn't want to push out a president in a time of war, even though they didn't necessarily believe that the war was necessarily a good thing to begin with. They were not entirely convinced of that. 2012, despite Mitt Romney's best efforts, people like Barack Obama, they felt like the nation was on the right foot, the economy was doing well, he won again. 4 years later, Hillary Clinton, with all the baggage she carried, with all the fact that many people did not like her, even in her own party, the old Clinton trade deals, which at the time were seen as to be make the Democratic Party look more moderate, backfired. NAFTA hurt Clinton. Even though NAFTA was the original idea of the Republican Party, Bill Clinton embraced it. And that came back to bite his wife in 2016. Which is why we have Donald Trump, who, to a degree, has dealt with trade policy to get rid of NAFTA, but not in the way we need it to be. It didn't really need to be gotten rid of. It just needed to be reformed to where. And here's the problem with world trade and all the so-called fair trade. The problem isn't fair trade. It's the fact that a lot of this fair trade is at the expense of the working people and also at the expense of the consumer. Because what fair trade means is basically corporations can go anywhere. They can get really cheap labor to build this stuff. That's why a lot of our jobs didn't stay in Mexico. They went to China. They went to India. They went to Bangladesh. They went to Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, and Vietnam. Why? Because they can get cheaper labor there. And I guarantee you that sometime in the near future, that's going to go to Africa. Because they'll find a way to get cheaper labor there. If it's not already starting over there. But the biggest problem in Andrew Yang, despite the fact that I don't agree with a lot of what he says, he's a little bit too far to the left for me. He's right about one thing. The biggest problem isn't jobs going overseas, it's jobs being eliminated because of automation. If I can do a job with a machine that can do the work of 6 people, then I don't have to worry about any of those 6 people being out for whatever reason. It doesn't need to have time off. It doesn't need vacation. It doesn't need medical care or benefits or anything like that. All it needs is just basic maintenance. What am I going to do? I'm going to buy the machine and put 6 people out of work. That is the economic reality that we're facing right now. It's that simple. If you can't see it, I hate to say it, but if you can't see that reality, ladies and gentlemen, then you're blind. Willingly or unwillingly blind, but it's there. And we have to transform our economy to deal with this automation. Doesn't mean we have to have universal income necessarily, although that might be an option, at least short term, if we don't do enough to deal with it now. And I will look into this later on. I got to do some research about this, but I think that really right now we have to have a really serious discussion in this country about the future of economic development in this country, because we are still behind the 8 ball with countries like China and the smaller countries like the South Asian countries and perhaps even the African countries and maybe the South American countries that decide that they're wanting to take the money. And a lot of this is because of China. And it makes me laugh when people say China's a communist country. They're communist in name only. In many cases, they're more capitalist than we are. They're more ruthlessly capitalist. Because basically in China, as long as you can make as much money as you want to, as long as you don't try to make yourself get in bad with the political people. If you're good with the government, you can make whatever money you want, and you can exploit them like any capitalist, old school capitalist would have done in America. And one of these days I'm going to talk about that, because the Republicans like to make a devil out of socialism, but the reality is the devil they like to make is not exactly as evil as they think it is, because in many cases the so-called communist countries were never really socialist to begin with. Or they may have started out that way, but it turned out that they became a lot more corrupt, not because of the socialism, but because of the rampant corruption in those countries. Like with Russia today, it's not a capitalist, it's not a socialist country anymore. It's very much a capitalist country, but it's still very corrupt. Which means the economic system had nothing to do with how bad things were. It's the system itself, the government system itself, the political system itself has been corrupt. You could have, in Mexico, you could have socialism tomorrow. It's still not going to get rid of the corruption there. The political system is corrupt. It doesn't matter if it's capitalist, socialist, or whatever. Cuba, same deal. Socialism never got rid of the corruption. Before Castro came along, Cuba was a capitalist haven, and it was corrupt as hell. Socialists came along, proclaiming they're going to clean it up. They didn't. Same in Venezuela. It isn't socialism the problem. It's the fact the political system is the problem. And that's why the Republicans love to use that, because it's easy to confuse people. But it is what it is. Well, that is it for tonight. Hope you enjoyed this. One of these days I'm going to talk bad about the Democrats. Maybe. Why I think that Bill Clinton's legacy will always be tarnished by Lewinsky. And with other things, why I think that in retrospect, maybe, just maybe, George Herbert Walker Bush should have won in 92, because it would have prevented Bill Clinton from having the legacy that he has. It may have brought Al Gore to the presidency. And let me talk about this for a second, because I like what ifs, because it makes you think about what might have happened if. And there's some people who don't like it because it's like, oh, it doesn't. Why are you wasting your time doing that? It's an interesting exercise, because what if could be down the road what actually happens. And that means we get to talk about Al Gore, who I'm not necessarily a fan of either. Used to be, but not so much anymore. And why I think he screwed up the 2000 election. I personally believe, you can talk all you want about Florida until your head explodes. To me, Al Gore lost that election before Election Day because he did not spend enough time in winning his own home state. Okay? Al Gore should have won that election. And it's his own damn fault for losing it. His campaign and his own fault for losing it. I don't want to hear about Florida. Yeah, there were shenanigans going on in Florida and all this, but the truth of the matter is, it wasn't Florida that lost him the election. It was Tennessee. He should have won his home state. He could have won his home state. He didn't win his home state. And it was a winnable state back then. And he lost it. And he lost the election. Had he won Tennessee, he would have been president. It's that simple. Florida didn't lose in the election. Tennessee did. Now, some people will disagree with me. Some people in the Democratic Party will disagree with me, I'm sure. I'm never backing down from that. Not until the day I die. Because of one simple thing. He took it for granted. He took Tennessee for granted. George W. Bush didn't. He won the state that won him the election. Forget about Florida. Tennessee cost Al Gore that election. All right, I'm going to get off here and go do something else. So, you folks, take it easy. Have a great day, and bye for now.